Welcome to the Legendarium, everyone. Take 3. This episode is quite the undertaking, as it turns out. We tried to do some fancier version of this recording, but we're going to go with the Zoom version now because the other software wasn't working so well. So I am Craig, your host, here with what I hope and believe will be a very interesting episode. I'm joined by AP Canavan, or I shouldn't say the Critical Dragon because there is somebody out there. You are a Critical Dragon on YouTube, and we are thrilled to have you here with us. Welcome, AP.
Thank you very much, Craig. It's a real pleasure to be here. And for the third time of trying to record this, hopefully this will work out.
So,
because I'm excited to talk about fantasy and the genre with you, because I know your interest in Tolkien, but also bigger than that about what the genre is doing. And Tolkien is central to it, but there are other elements that have influenced the genre.
Absolutely. And that is largely what we will be talking about. Although who knows what, little will-o'-the-wisps will be chasing off into the woods. You never know. So the other guest that we have joining us from an equally exotic location, AP is in Belfast, and this one's from Fort Collins, Colorado, is Drew McCaffrey from Inking Out Loud. Hi, Drew.
Yep. Hi, Craig.
Good to have you back. I won't repeat all of the insults that I had for you on take 2. I'm just going to give you a break from that, and just rest assured, everybody listening, that I have lots of insults for Drew. That he's the worst and everybody hates him, and okay, we can leave it there. All right. No, but I should say, before I get into today's topic, I am begging all of you to go to thelegendarium.com, especially if you are or will be in the vicinity of Portland, Oregon at the end of May, because we're doing a Legendarium meetup in Portland, I think on May 28th, and you can find details if you go to the Legendarium Con link at thelegendarium.com. How was that for confusing? All right. So yes, please go check that out. You can also find links to the Discord server where you can join in the conversation in what is, and I mean this quite literally, the nicest corner of the internet. And you can also find links to our Patreon there if you'd like to support the show, O Valley of Plenty. Okay, so gentlemen, take number 3. Let's try to get into this. I am pretty sure that AP was saying some really interesting things when we tried this before, but we couldn't confirm because the connection issues were pretty bad. But let's introduce this again. The topic, and I'm reading this off of the email that AP sent to me about what his PhD is in. It's on the narratological impact of role-playing games on the fantasy genre and how they shifted the genre metatext. Now, AP sent me this email and said, hey, here's what my PhD was in. And I had a reaction that I could describe, as inappropriate for a podcast setting. But really what I'll just say is I got really excited. That sounds so interesting. Okay, so let me read that back for you. The narratological impact of role-playing games on the fantasy genre and how they shifted the genre metatext. AP, what does that mean?
Well, very simply put, we have an impression about what the genre is, what the rules of the genre are, how it's structured. And so much of that was tied into an understanding of what Tolkien did. But my argument in the PhD was, after Tolkien, there have been other texts that have actually changed what we see in the genre and what the sort of the paradigm of the genre is, whether you want to call it a paradigm shift or a step change. But one of those key texts that is often overlooked, particularly in literary circles, would be role-playing games, and how role-playing games influence computer games, and how computer games and that entire construct of storytelling and narrative and the perception and reception of fantasy has actually had a very significant impact on the genre and the type of storytelling that we have there, which is not coming from Tolkien. It's actually a change from Tolkien. And it's not to do disservice to the impact that Tolkien had. He is still a very key figure, but role-playing games changed some of the rules, sometimes subtly and sometimes actually quite radically. And we sometimes overlook that because we never think in terms of literary evolutions of narrative in different media, narrative in different forms. So a very simple, straightforward example of this. Before Tolkien, there are incidental texts, and there are texts that have, say, active magic, where you have spellcasters casting spells, and what has commonly sort of become known as a hard magic system. But it was never rigorous. The magic in Tolkien is numinous, or what we now call soft magic. But in between Tolkien and the modern genre, you have role-playing games, which codified a magic system. We did not talk about magic systems before role-playing games, because role-playing games took the idea of magic and went, here are the rules. You need these rules as a player because it gives you repeatable effects. You know, I have to do X in order to create Y, because you need that as a mechanic in a game. Do we understand how Gandalf uses magic? No, you don't. You have no need to understand Gandalf's magic. He is just a wizard. He just does things. And so when we think of the focus now on magic must be a magic system, even putting the word system in, before you consider hard magic or soft magic, using that word system in combination with magic is entirely due to role-playing games. And because magic is so central to a lot of the genre, you can see that that's coming from games. That's not coming from Tolkien.
This is really, really interesting. And we talk, Drew and I are big fans of and beta readers for Brandon Sanderson. And, obviously we talk about Brandon a lot on this show. And one of the things that comes up a lot in discussions of, say, Mistborn is people will say, this feels like I'm playing a video game. The way that the characters use the magic system, it feels like I'm playing a video game. It's so exciting. It's so visceral. We've talked about that, years ago on this podcast. So you mentioned that the computer games, or we'll just call them video games. Okay, so sorry, console people, take it easy, console people. That video games took these rules from role-playing games, things like Dungeons and Dragons, and all of their many imitators. Is there any difference in? Sorry, I'm getting to a point. I'm getting to a question here. We talk about, okay, this feels like a video game. This obviously is informed by, or has in mind, video games. Is there any difference between that and a role-playing game, and the rules that are set up, or the way that these writers are writing their books, or is it a very, very solid through line between RPGs and video games?
Well, when you think about it, so RPGs, when they were created, provided mathematical models for like random number generation, of using dice to decide whether or not something was successful. That's a mathematical and statistical computation. What are computers really good at? Exactly that same computation. So when you program a computer game, you go, I need a definitive list of what the character can do. But within role-playing games, because yes, that is a component, but you're also dealing with real humans who are sitting around the table. And a games master or DM or even a group of players can homebrew. They can choose to ignore rules. They can apply rules differently. They can tweak things. You can't do that with a computer game. But what you find was a lot of people who played and experimented with computer games, with role-playing games, were also people who were on board with some of the very early computer programming. And so a lot of that statistical modeling for effects was, we can make a game out of this. And using that idea of computation, you could create game variants. And then that becomes consolidated because the flexibility of what a computer model can do is obviously less than what the human mind can do. Because you can say, oh, that rule doesn't apply at this moment. You can't do that in a computer game because the game, the program needs to have finite boundaries. And so you can see that it's a parallel sort of construction where you had overlapping membership of these different groups. And some of the earliest computer games drew from what role-playing games were doing as using this as a model, a statistical model for how to do conflict resolution. The idea that how much damage can you do to a character, and a health bar, and all of these things that you can see very clearly in role-playing games that then come across. And of course, both sort of ludic strategies have evolved and diversified over time, but you can trace it back to those initial different war game constructions that have been around since the 19th century. War games and using dice and various methods of statistical comparison have been around since the 19th century. But it was like D&D and advanced D&D that took it and morphed it into fantasy. And then from that, the creation of reusable settings and fantasy worlds, the creation of all of these things where they drew on existing fantasy texts like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings or Vance's Dying Earth. They drew from that to create an experience, and then that inspired imitators and inspired other people to do different variations.
I'm glad you brought up Dying Earth there. I feel like Vance gets lost in the mix so often, but he really was a foundational actor in how fantasy has progressed, how science fiction has progressed, and how the two have blended over the years.
Drew, I was gonna. Oh, sorry. Go on, AP.
Well, I was going to say, like, Mazarian the Magician is the one where you have it's the prismatic spray spell, and the whole concept of you only have a certain number of spells that you can cast during a day, and then you have to rest and rememorize them. Anyone who's played D&D or almost any computer game RPG is familiar with running out of spells and having to rest to reimagine them. That comes from Vance. He was and acknowledged in Appendix N of D&D when Gygax and Arneson created it.
Yeah, and I do notice, or I think I notice, is that the Folio Society Book of the New Sun behind you?
Yeah.
Oh, gorgeous.
You just got Drew's attention.
Yeah. So, I was looking at that. I was like, is that, I don't remember the cover. Is that Terminus S? Like,
Drew, you're a writer, and based on the short story that you just sent me over the weekend, a pretty darn talented one. So in fact, I should plug Inking Out Loud. Please go check out Inking Out Loud. And if you join their Patreon, you get to read Drew's writing, which is quite good. Anyway, Drew, what we just talked about for the last 5 minutes or so, how does this strike you as a writer? Do you have a sense of history when it comes to writing your own short stories and books? Or is this kind of just the water that you're swimming in at the moment? Does that make sense? Like, are you conscious of this sort of history?
You know, that's really interesting. In a theoretical sense, yes, I'm very conscious of it. But when I sit down to write a story, it's not often that I am deliberately trying to write in conversation with something. I've only really done that a couple of times. But I think part of it is that I never was really into RPGs or, you know, Dungeons and Dragons, anything like that. My earliest kind of interaction with that form was reading the Dragonlance novels by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman as a, I don't know, 11, 12-year-old, you know, somewhere in there. And I knew, oh, this was based on a game they played, but I didn't know the game. I didn't understand how Dungeons and Dragons really worked until much later in my life. Now I've played like a couple of homebrew things, but it's not a major formative part of my genre education. And so hearing AP talk about this is really fascinating because I'm seeing all of these connections forming that make tons of sense, but that I wasn't really aware of, simply because there was kind of a hole in my fantasy history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I played Dungeons and Dragons for the first time on this podcast. I think it was episode maybe 34, 35, somewhere in there. People can go listen to me and Ryan play Dungeons and Dragons for the first time extremely poorly, but it was a lot of fun. So yeah, that my history with it is spotty at best. And that actually makes me want to ask you, AP, and I think this will be a fruitful road for us to go down eventually, or maybe even right away. But what made you want to study this? What led you to this subject, to do your thesis on this type of thing? Where did this come from?
Well, like a lot of people who read fantasy, I have always loved fantasy writing. And when I was a kid and I was reading like David Eddings and David Gemmell, and you go, neither one of those is impacted by RPGs, or so you would think. Reading Tolkien as a child and loving Middle Earth and the whole creation of something fantastic, that there was this entire genre that I loved. And to be perfectly frank, a lot of academia doesn't particularly respect it. But it was fascinating to me that any academic articles that I was reading at that time when I was at university, they always pointed to Tolkien. And I'm going, but you're ignoring Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, Ravenloft. You're ignoring all of those, not only that sort of franchise IP fiction, and all of the computer games that are based on it, and the writers of those books who inspired readers of those books to become authors themselves, that the players of those games who went on to become authors themselves, that this was an entire form of influence on the genre that wasn't addressed because it wasn't books. People always looked at it and went, here are fantasy books. This is the tradition of how fantasy as literature has evolved. And you go, we don't live in a vacuum. We are connected to narrative in film, television, books, and games, and computer games and board games, that we live in a sea of narrative. And we take these influences from everywhere. And so it's never a neat connection. And anytime you see a neat connection, you tend to go, that's a little too neat. And so I was fascinated to see whether or not you could tease out at least some points of connection to this evolution of the genre. Because what we have in the modern day doesn't really correspond to anything that Tolkien did definitively. It's quite varied.
Okay, so yeah, going back to the beginning of that, I love this idea that there's another writer that I was reading recently who started a book of his with, why do I write the way I do? It's because frustration is a muse. He'd get mad about some topic and need to go research it. So what I hear is, why isn't anybody talking about this? Fine, I'll do it. Is that basically it?
And Drew, I'm sure you have experienced this, that you want to write the stories that inspire you, that intrigue you.
Yes.
You've read something and you go, you know what, if I was going to write this, I wouldn't do that. I'm going to do something different. Your work, even if you're not intending it to be in dialogue with specific work, is always in dialogue with what has come before, because it's in dialogue with what you have read.
Absolutely. Yeah. Look, I would say the one thing that is most present in my mind when I'm writing is, I would say, my particular style of prose, and how I find it fascinating that I write so unlike many of my favorite writers. The real formative, foundational fantasy series for me was The Wheel of Time. I picked up The Eye of the World when I was 11 years old, and within a couple of months I had read the 9 published books, and I was like, I want to write stories because I read this series. But I write completely unlike Robert Jordan. I write completely unlike George R. R. Martin or Brandon Sanderson or whomever. And if anything, if there's one author I say I write sort of like, it would be Glenn Cook. But that's really interesting because I had been writing books and stories for years before I ever picked up a Glenn Cook novel.
That sound you hear, dear listener, is the sound of Drew patting himself on the back.
No. Just because I write in a sparing style doesn't mean I'm as good as Glenn Cook.
I'm messing with you. Okay, go on, Drew.
But so there's an awareness when I sit down and put words on the page of how I'm writing and how it differs from the, what has come before, as you said. Although I want to kind of rewind a little bit, and something that's been kind of niggling at my mind when we're talking about the evolution of fantasy and going from pre-Tolkien, and then, going through this sort of filter of RPGs and then computer games. AP especially, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think since the proliferation of visual media, there has been a fundamental shift in the style of writing fantasy to be more cinematic?
Well, there are 2 points, actually, that it's a really good point to bring up. There are 2 different things. Firstly, filmic and televisual representations and consumption of media is a much more passive process than reading. Reading is much more active. But the more we have readership that their predominant education in how to process narrative is from a filmic or televisual medium, the more the market rewards writing that is written that way. And the same is with the commodification and genreification of fiction. Like you were just talking about, oh, I write like Glenn Cook. And you go, well, I would have, if I was going to pick a point of comparator, you go, well, no, you're writing in that instead of Faulkner in a Hemingway style, but filtered through war fiction from Vietnam and Korean War fiction. That the element that Glenn Cook picked up on was he took that style of writing associated with Vietnam War fiction written by veterans and wrote it in a fantasy world. But when we talk about fantasy, we tend to ignore all of the external aspects. And so, yes, there is an element of commercial genre focusing more on what is popular for a readership and that commodification. And because of the impact of television, because of the impact of film, yes, it does lend itself to what we tend to reward in terms of more accessible or easier to read narratives, and moves further and further away from what used to be valued about literature. And the number of fantasy readers now, you say, well, have you read any of like Jane Austen or the Brontes or Charles Dickens? They go, why would I read that? Faulkner, Hemingway, have you read that? Well, no, I only like fantasy. And it's because we are so time poor in the modern era, despite all of the advances, we are incredibly time poor, and we find something we like and we want to replicate it. And one of the greatest educations for any author or any reader is to read outside your preferred genre, because techniques and styles of writing that you think, oh, this author has just done this has blown my mind, no one has ever done this before. And someone who has studied literature goes, actually, and they are the well actually person, but they have a point in that that's a really common technique elsewhere. And there is a cinematic element because that has dominated media discourse. We live in a narrative media landscape, not just a literary landscape.
So is there similar to the fantasy literature genre as such, Tolkien casts a long shadow, obviously. But on the film landscape, and we could talk about RPGs as well. Okay, so obviously there, oh, hey, cat. Drew's got a cat, okay. With RPGs, we can talk about Dungeons and Dragons all day long, right? And in film terms, there's the Jackson trilogy that came along in 2001. But am I missing anything film-wise before Jackson, or RPG-wise after Dungeons and Dragons? Are there other touchstones that we should be aware of that have informed literature in the last few decades?
I would say film noir has had a massive impact on genre fiction in general.
I'll give you 2 examples. The first is scene transitions. If you go back to a lot of older cinema, you'll have someone wake up and they'll go in, they'll brush their teeth, they'll get dressed, you'll see them doing their tie, you'll have them walking downstairs, they'll get in the car, they'll drive to work. Now we have a shot of the alarm clock goes off, they slap it off, and then the next scene is they are in work, and that entire scene transition is now implied. And Inception played with this, where the reader is inferring what happened in between. Because if you think the number of films now where someone starts a conversation, you're driving along in a car and they're talking about something, and then it cuts to them arriving at their destination and they're still having the conversation at that point, because it's just a way to get rid of the boring car journey. But if you think about it, they started that car journey that's half an hour long. They had a point, then there's an implied half-hour jump, and they are still having that conversation. You go, no one carries on what did they just sit in silence for half an hour? And then, now that we've arrived, yes, I'll just finish my point now. So scene transitions and that excising of transitionary material has radically changed in literature as a response to how it has become popularized in film. That's one of the implications. I think one of the other points is, if you think of Jackson's Lord of the Rings, and we talk about the Fellowship, the creation of the Quest group, one of the terms to refer to that is the Seven Samurai.
Sure.
Oh, look, quest formation in the Seven Samurai. That's actually a term that we can use to describe it. Do you think that didn't have an impact? Or the Magnificent Seven? The film and television have been using the same concepts, and people unconsciously or consciously borrow them, or if not borrowing directly from that, from other iterations from other people who have borrowed it. The long sweeping shots that Jackson used for the landscape, Lawrence of Arabia, the English Patient, like you have all of these grand narratives that show the landscape, particularly the Western, where the Western that placed the human figures as tiny in this grand landscape. All of those shots, that technique, that way of emphasizing the smallness of humanity against the grandness of the narrative, the Western did a lot of that. The use of all of these different techniques, and film studies quite rightly focuses a lot on the Western because it developed the techniques that everyone else then was influenced by, and then they influenced other people.
Oh, man. Well, I feel like I need to close up shop. This is too interesting. There's nowhere to go from here, but damn, this is too interesting. Drew, you look like you have a thought before I move on. You look like you're ready to say something. I do have another question, but it can wait.
No, I'm just kind of considering how much we've talked about film and how much we've talked about the shift in science fiction and fantasy since Tolkien, and yet we haven't mentioned Star Wars. And AP, when you were mentioning so many of those movies, massive inspirations for how George Lucas filmed Star Wars. You know, we have, again, a fellowship, right? We have our rogue and our warrior and our wizard and all of that. And then we also have the Western influences. We have the influences from Seven Samurai. We like Star Wars was sort of its own kind of sidetrack alongside D&D, and like trying to think of how to put this. Star Wars became such a ubiquitous cultural touchstone that it almost seems like it's just been removed entirely from so many academic conversations. Like it's like it's too poppy, it's too popcorn, and despite that, there is all of this rich literary value in Star Wars. How it spans back, it touches on things like the monomyth, and spans generations of fantasy literature.
Well, let me put a point to you. Lucas was very clear that his structure for Star Wars, the narratological structure he was using, was an articulation of Campbell's The Monomyth. So if you're going to study what Star Wars does or what narrative is doing, do you study Star Wars or do you study the thing that Star Wars is based on? Mm-hmm. When you talk about space Western and the influences of the Western, do you look at Star Wars or do you go back to the Western that actually created these things? It's not that Star Wars is excluded from the discussion. It's that Star Wars is an articulation of the earlier points. So if you study the foundational points, then yes, you understand Star Wars. When you look at the formation of the Quest Party, that's not unique to Star Wars. So why would you study Star Wars for that? When you talk about space wizards with magic swords and magic powers, well, why not look at the articulation in Tolkien, pre-Star Wars? Because that's an articulation of those points. So it's not that Star Wars is discounted, but Star Wars, in a lot of respects, didn't refine any positions. It was a melange of previously existing positions. So yes, like I agree, Star Wars should be studied and Star Wars is interesting to look at. But how much of it was Star Wars articulating a position that then refined the genre? Because Star Wars covered itself in a sort of science fiction skin when everything about the story was fantasy.
Yes.
So let me it's not pushback so much as it is just I guess a challenging question here, and that is, what is our limiting principle when it comes to this? Because you can keep going and keep going and never come to any conclusions, because it's like, well, yeah, but this person or this film or this whatever did it. I mean, you go back to, well, the Odyssey had the Argonauts. Is that quest formation? And then you go back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you're like, well, there's a lot of stuff here that eventually there has to be a place where we can say, a lot of the stuff that is influencing, say, Drew as a writer, he's probably not consciously going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh and going, okay, what can I draw from this? Does that make sense? When and how do we stop ourselves from chasing that rabbit into the past?
Well, this is one of these big arguments in academia by trying to identify an text, the original text. And the thing is, you can't, because no writer writes in a vacuum. Yeah. And there are always going to be other influences. But we talk about the general consolidation of a concept or an idea. If you want to talk about the start, when did postmodernism start? What was the exact date? What was the first postmodern text? And you will always have texts prior to that date that are doing things that now get described as postmodern, even though they were written during a modernist period or earlier. When we talk about the fantasy genre coalescing around a concept of Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work, yes, it sort of coalesces around that point. But that doesn't mean that George MacDonald Fraser wasn't writing fantasy, or Lord Dunsany wasn't writing fantasy, or J.M. Barrie wasn't writing fantasy. Fantasy extends back. But when we talk about the formation, we're talking about a general consolidation or coalescence of a concept into a much broader and recognizable category. And it's not ever that you discount, and I hope I didn't come across as saying, don't ever look at Star Wars. But you look at Star Wars in that conversation across multiple disciplines, multiple types of narrative, and multiple genres. And it is part of that conversation and evolution. It is a key text. But whenever you do any sort of academic study, you always try to delineate and carve out a niche. And that's where definitional problems arise, and why academics spend so much time going, I'm looking at this to this and only that. Yeah. They're not doing that because they don't know about anything else, but you have to find a way to limit the borders of the conversation.
Otherwise, it goes on forever. Yeah, go on, Drew.
So where I'm kind of coming down on Star Wars, like the most value that I personally would find in analyzing it is how it combines all of these influences, and how, like you said, it's a melange of different things, and how it inspired another generation to combine things like that in
like Frank Herbert's Dune.
In a more pop culture sense, how much that has influenced the what years, 2022, 45 years since Star Wars came out, and
time is a flat circle. It's meaningless now. It's post 2020. Time has no meaning. Okay.
And this is the thing about individuals. Like, we as individuals can talk about what influenced us, but if we isolate Star Wars, because that is an influence on you, and then I go, but Dune by Frank Herbert, which obviously was a massive influence on Lucas. If I encountered Dune before I encountered Star Wars, then I'm always going to see the precedent set in Dune, not Star Wars as the precedent. Go forward 20 more years and the next generation looking at it and they'll go, well, Star Wars was a really old thing, but I remember Battlestar Galactica, the miniseries. And you go, but Battlestar Galactica only existed because of Star Wars, and Star Wars only existed because of Dune, and Dune only existed because of other planetary romances like John Carter of Mars.
Yeah.
Everything is a continuum and it is a constant evolution. And yeah, texts rise in importance for discussion and then fall away as new things replace them. And that's part of what I was trying to articulate about the impact that RPGs had on particularly fantasy in the 80s and 90s. Like, people forget that Andre Norton, female fantasy author, was the first person to write an RPG influenced and based fantasy novel. That's almost always overlooked. When we look at people go, oh, X author has been really influential, and you go, well, they sold 100,000 copies. You know, that is an influence. Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman's Dragonlance sold much more than that, but we don't look at it because, oh, well, that's just schlock and genre fiction. But look at the popular influence it had. And not only is it just that series, it's all of the linked Dragonlance series, and then the linked Forgotten Realms, and the linked Greyhawk, and then people who read the Halo franchise novels. The Halo franchise novels wouldn't exist without Halo the game. Halo the game wouldn't exist without RPGs. And even that whole concept of the expanded universe, was kicked off by a lot of the RPG stuff.
So basically what I'm hearing is that when it comes to these genre stories that we all love so much, it's just a giant tangled ball of yarns, so to speak. It will never unknot it. So why not just give it a big hug, right? So just love the ball. And sorry, Drew, go on.
Yeah, well, it's funny because when you talk about influence and how certain works are perceived as being more influential than others, and that may not necessarily line up with book sales. There are different sorts of influence. There's a cultural influence from something like Star Wars or Marvel or whatever that is just everywhere, and then there is an influence in creation. And that's where you get authors like Glenn Cook or Gene Wolfe, who really didn't sell very many copies in the grand scheme of things, but a lot of authors read them. And that's when you end up with a Steven Erikson and a Joe Abercrombie and a George Martin and a Robert Jordan. They're these guys who did end up transcending the genre and becoming the massive international bestsellers. And they built off of something maybe read by a fraction of a percentage of the people who read their books.
And when you think of, say, going back to Star Wars as an example, what about Star Trek, which preceded it? And in that you had the planetary landing party, the boarding party that went down of Scott or of McCoy and Kirk and Spock going down with ancillary characters.
And I was going to say, everybody forgets the red shirts.
And also we sometimes overestimate the number of red shirts who actually died, because it's then the popular consciousness and popular misremembering of things, like beam me up Scotty, and you go, well, is that actually what he said? No, but we have a popular almost misunderstanding of these things that then enters the popular consciousness, becomes part of the mythos, and then gets replicated.
And then you end up with red shirts by John Scalzi.
Yeah, red shirts by John Scalzi. Because it becomes, I suppose, what's the common term now? Memeable?
Yes.
That all of these things, and direct influences on authors, indirect influences on authors, direct influences on readers, indirect. And it is such a giant, Frank Pratchett referred to it as a cauldron of soup, or a narrative gumbo. He had various different ways he articulated this, and everything goes into it. And every author draws forth from a lot of the same ingredients their own individual articulation. And to go back to the original premise of what we started with, the reason I did the thesis was not to say that Tolkien is no longer relevant. It was to bring into consideration another text that adds to our understanding. And it wasn't to say, don't look at Tolkien anymore. It's consider it from this position, because that's actually quite revelatory. Magic systems, acquisitive quests instead of quests to get rid of something. I think everyone thinks of the quest, they went and got rid of the ring. How many quests have you read where it's all about getting rid of something apart from Tolkien?
Right.
Even since it's not a very common thing. So I have a question. I want to start shifting gears, and we'll give this, another 5 or 10 minutes of topic or of discussion on this topic. But let me ask, based on this, all this the narrative gumbo, the giant ball of yarn that we've been talking about, this is recalling to my mind a presentation that was given several years ago in Australia, I believe. Don't hold me to that, but I think it was in Australia. A woman who was giving a talk to a crowd of folks who were, like-minded to the three of us, I suppose, in their interests. And she was railing against Tolkien and the gatekeeping, and we need to, how dare you expect me to reach, I've proudly never read Tolkien, and reject all of this, the impact that you say that he must have on modern writers, whatever. It was definitely an interesting and provocative talk that she gave, shall we say. But so I was thinking of that, and the question in my mind is, can someone can someone successfully write a story without reference to the gumbo? Or is, like, if somebody is kind of being reactionarily minded and saying, I refuse to read the stuff that everybody says I should read, I'm just going to write my own thing and do it without reference to these to these works that everybody talks about, is that possible? Can they do it successfully? Is this stuff just the ocean that we swim in, and it's impossible to escape the influence of the gumbo? I'm calling it that now forever. So yeah.
No, Terry Goodkind did it. Remember, he doesn't write fantasy. He writes real literature, and he's never read any other fantasy.
Oh boy. That's right.
The similarities between Sword of Truth and Wheel of Time were entirely coincidental.
Yeah.
Sure.
The similarities between Sword of Truth and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, entirely incidental.
Yeah.
But to take a first stab at it, if you want to not write what Tolkien wrote, then you have to know what Tolkien wrote.
Yeah.
So to write against something, or to write something different to Tolkien, then you need to know what Tolkien wrote.
Yeah.
So it's slightly disingenuous to say, I'm writing my own thing that has nothing to do with Tolkien, when Tolkien has not only his body of work, but the influence that Tolkien has had on the rest of the genre. And that is not to say that authors don't have unique visions, but we are living in a very complex web of interrelationships, of influence and expression.
Gumbo. We're living in gumbo.
Yeah, but China Miéville wrote against some of the stuff in Tolkien, very deliberately so.
Yeah.
So if you've read China Miéville, you've read something that's in dialogue with Tolkien, even if you've never read Tolkien. When you've read The Wheel of Time or The Sword of Truth, you've read something that was emulating aspects of Tolkien, even if it is not Tolkien. When you've read something that is arguing against a perceived notion in the genre. So the Malazan Book of the Fallen deconstructed that sort of Anglo-focused or Eurocentric view of secondary fantasy. The Malazan Book of the Fallen argued against that. So if you've read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, you've read the counter-argument or the counter-example to Eurocentric or Anglo-centric fantasy narrative set in a pseudo-medieval land. All of these things are in constant conversation and influence to greater or lesser extents. And it's not that anyone is saying that author is copying that author, or that author is wrong to say that they're not doing those things. We live in a complex web of interrelationships between what we have read, what influenced those authors that wrote the things that we read, what influenced the authors that were read by the authors that we read. And so it continues, that it is a massive spread of this. And then when you add in film and television, if you've played any form of computer game, again, complex web of relationships. So, you know, that's how I would approach that initial point.
So, so it sounds like Dr. Strangelove and how I learned to stop worrying and eat the gumbo. Just there's no escaping it, and to engage is to interact with these things, right? So.
Yeah.
Drew, for both of you, actually, I'm going to take a hard right turn as we finish up this discussion and go way back to the beginning of our discussion. And forgive me, I'm pretty sure we talked about this in this discussion, but we tried it 3 times, for the first 5 minutes. So I'm pretty sure you talked about magic systems, and I want to go back to that. Okay, so we're leaving this, we're leaving the gumbo behind, and I want to talk about magic systems because you gave. This may be repetitive from the beginning of our conversation, but I want to make sure I get it, because you gave some definitions for hard and soft magic that are slightly different from the way that we've talked about it on this show for years, at least if I understood you correctly. So I want to go back to that, because I know that is that's part of this whole discussion. Again, rewinding back to the idea of RPGs and video games and their impact on literature. Hard and soft magic system. How do you define that? And then maybe we can riff off of that definition for a moment.
Tell you what, why don't you give me your definition, saying, as apparently I don't think about it the same way. So you give me your definition.
Yeah, it's like I said, if there is a difference, it would be subtle, but I thought I detected something. So a hard magic system is something that is, well, systematic, to put it frankly, whereas a soft magic system is not. But then the lines get grayed. Okay, so sorry, let me go back. A soft magic system, like you said, Gandalf just does things. It's just magic. He, points at something and says, be on fire, and it's on fire, whatever.
No,
or not
Gandalf
even that.
Doesn't do that.
Well, no, he just puts his staff out, right, and melts snow without uttering a spell or whatever, right? Whereas Harry Potter would have to recite an incantation. But then that's where that gray area comes in. And that's where the definition gets a little fuzzy. Like in Harry Potter, is it a hard magic system because they're using spells, or is it a soft magic system because we never have a definition for the boundaries of that magic system, right? So a hard magic system maybe has those boundaries where a soft magic system lacks them. Is that as simple a definition as we need?
Well, Drew, you're the creative person. How would you approach this?
So I would approach hard versus soft magic systems in the sense that there are clearly articulated limits and mechanics for how magic is used and what it can do. And this goes to I don't remember which one of them, but Sanderson's Laws of Magic, where he talks about how there's this relationship between what magic can solve and what sort of conflicts you write into your book. And a soft magic system is perfectly usable as long as you're not just using soft magic to solve all your problems, because then it's narratively unsatisfying.
Well, for a particular type of narrative, because again, the sort of Sandersonian approach to fantasy narratives typically places magic very central to the core of the narrative, whereas Lord of the Rings does not. Magic is not at the core of that narrative. What are the spells what are the magical effects that Gandalf creates? He makes an illusion of riders and horses on the ford, as Elrond does the magic of making the ford crash into the Nazgul. He makes his staff light up. I'm sorry, you could, do that with a Zippo. A lot of what Gandalf does in terms of magic is not about active spell magic. It's not about active effects. It's not about replicable effects. It's much more numinous and almost religious. It's about a divine sense of power.
Yes.
But if we think of what Sanderson was articulating, first of all, this is by analogy to hard and soft SF. So it's not that Sanderson came up with this idea,
No, not at all.
in a vacuum, because it's a division that's been used in SF for a long time about extrapolation from knowable and explainable and explained aspects of science in hard SF, that you must abide by these rules. Soft SF, on the other hand, you don't, because Star Trek is soft SF. How does the transport system work? They can give you a pseudo-scientific explanation, but it doesn't actually correspond to our knowledge or understanding of the universe.
Yeah. And then meanwhile, you have somebody like Samuel Delany, who's writing pages of mathematical equations to explain what's going on in his books.
Or Hal Clement and Mission of Gravity, where all of that was based on his understanding of gravimetrics and how that planet would actually work and how gravity would work. And someone actually wrote in and corrected one of his equations. And I think in a subsequent edition of it, he included that to go, yes, I made a mistake in how I calculated this.
That's fantastic.
But when we think of hard magic as a system, Drew hit it on the head. It's not just that it has rules and limits, because lots of soft magic systems have rules and limits. One of the big distinguishing characteristics is not only that those rules and limits are made knowable and explainable to the reader, but also that it is usually quite central to what is going on in the narrative. Because Mistborn, perfect example. Hard magic system. Well, apart from when Vin absorbs all of that power from the mist, slightly goes against the rules as they were explained to the reader and set up for the reader and delineated in the text. You go, so does that suddenly make it's not a hard magic system anymore? It's a soft magic system because that rule can just be thrown out the window. A lot of it has to do with the construction and focus of narrative. So it's not that any one is better or worse. It's how they are used. You can have a hard magic system that is terribly used and constantly used all the time to solve problems. And you can see that the whole narrative construct was to set up a problem solely to be solved by that thing. And you go, that's not satisfying either. Or you can have a soft magic system that provides very satisfying conclusions because it does something different. It is sometimes about inspiring awe and wonder about the power of magic. In Malazan, magic is used almost very consciously as an analogy for power. And yet there are very clear rules that both Erickson and Esselmont are aware of. They just don't make them explicit to the reader because it is not necessary. It's not the focus of the narrative. But that magic in Malazan has rules. Harry Potter doesn't have rules.
Yeah.
Because magic just does what is narratively convenient. None of it makes any sense. There's no cohesion to it. Does that make it bad? Well, it makes it a bad hard magic system. But that's not what it is. It's a soft magic system.
Right. Oh, man.
Now, I'm curious. This is sort of tangential to this idea of hard and soft magic systems, but going back to the progression of magic systems as a thing, you mentioned Jack Vance earlier and how we got this idea of finite spells, things you have to relearn, rememorize. And of course, very much inspired by Jack Vance, the Book of the New Sun, where you have this phenomenon, the sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. You find yourself wondering while you read the Book of the New Sun or while you read The Dying Earth, is this magic or is this just some inscrutably advanced technology? And you get the lines blurring between science and magic. And now we've almost done a complete 180 where magic in something like Mistborn or the Stormlight Archive it's magic, but it's almost indistinguishable from science because it is so hard, so clearly delineated what these things can do. And we have scenes in the Stormlight Archive of people approaching magic using the scientific method,
But okay, so there are a couple of interesting aspects about this, because again, a lot of it comes to do with narrative focus. So you could say that wish magic just wishing things is a very soft magic. You can just wish things, but you can construct a really interesting and brilliant fantasy story about and using wish magic because the wish was not properly formulated or the unforeseen consequences coming from the wish.
Yeah.
When we think about Sandersonian's or Sanderson's approach in the Stormlight Archives, Sanderson, as gifted as he is, cannot come up with a complete understanding of all of the potential ramifications of that magic system because he is only one person. No one can understand the full ramifications of secondary world building. But also, how unique is that? And you go, well, it comes from a divine source that is then put into a battery form and then gives you access to one of 3 levels of power. And you can talk about it, well, it's essentially either divine magic, clerical magic from D&D, or where you have a magical battery that you can create, or you can look at it in terms of an analogy to solar energy and how we manipulate that. But like all of these things, it all depends on the different ways we look at it and perceive it. And we don't view I think you don't view identifying soft magic or identifying hard magic as the thing. That helps you describe what is in a narrative. It is never the key aspect to how you're going to enjoy the narrative, because characterization, plot, story, world building and secondary world elements, the creation of a story world, the narration, the narrative style, the prose, all of the sound, tone, all of these different things are how you are the things that affect how you like or don't like a book. Yeah. Whether or not it possesses magic, be it hard, soft, be it systematized, is never the defining thing. It's only ever one element. And depending on how strong that element is, you can look back at, was it Master of the Five Magics that detailed different ways to approach magic? Again, post-RPGs. We can look at what Vance did and we go, but that's not a hard magic system. It just said that was limitations on magic. And limitations can apply to soft and hard magic. Limitations can apply to technology, because one of the problems with a lot of, one of the issues I had with Star Trek Discovery is not understanding the ramifications of the technology. And when technology just hand waves an answer, limitations are so important for writers because it gives them something to write against. It gives a framework to argue against and find a way around that leads to and inspires greater creativity. And it's those limitations that are far more important, I think, than whether or not it is systematized or whether or not it is made explicit to a reader.
Yeah, like how Brandon Sanderson uses hard magic in his stories, very often the central problem to be solved is the magic. It's Elantris. Why is the magic broken? How can we fix this? Mistborn. Why is the Lord Ruler the way he is? How do we beat him? And it's focused on the magic. And so the magic becomes the problem to solve rather than using the magic to solve problems.
And like we have that with Tolkien has a world in which magic is integral. You have elves that can live essentially, in general, forever. And you go, well, how do they do that? Oh, it's because they're magical. Well, okay, show me on this diagram where their magic is coming from. You go, no, we don't.
Show me on the doll where the magic touched you.
Yeah. The Balrog. It's this demonic end. Like, even in like one of the jokes about D&D, you've walked into a room, it's a 10 by 10 room, and there are 12 orcs there. What? They've been inside this locked room forever. Like when they go down into Moria, what are all of the goblins and orcs in Moria eating? Where is their food coming from? There is no food anywhere in Moria. Are they just chewing rock? But when we see Jackson's representation of Gondor, you look at Gondor and go, well, how are they feeding themselves? There are no farms outside Gondor. But we all know when you read the book, Tolkien was very specific about putting farmland in front of Gondor. The riders of Rohan live on these plains of grass. Where are the herds of horses and cattle and the food? We have willing suspension of disbelief. And the important part about that is willing. If you're not willing to suspend your disbelief, you can pick holes in any narrative construction. I can pick holes in Sanderson, Tolkien, Erickson. I can pick holes in any of their worlds if I am not willing to go with it, to follow it. And we all have different thresholds for where that willingness disappears, where our suspension of disbelief can be shattered and remove us from that immersion.
I think that right there is probably the best place to end this. We could go, it sounds like we could go for a long time. And I'll be honest, this is one of those dream episodes as a host where I get to just kind of like, throw a little question out there and watch the two of you go nuts for 10 minutes straight. And then, okay, I'll throw another question at you. This has been really fascinating. And AP, you've been very generous with your time, and you as well, Drew. Thank you both so much for this. This is an episode that I will be returning to myself a lot. I think I'll be listening to this one a lot. So yeah, I really appreciate it from both of you.
And thank you so much for inviting me on. I am sorry, must be my end of technology that ruined everything, and that's led to this ruining your day. So thank you so much for having me on.
No, nothing can ruin today. It's my birthday, which I'm happy to say because it'll be too late by the time this comes out in a week and a half. No, it's long past. Thank you, and nobody can do anything about it because it was a week and a half ago when you hear this. So,
hang on a sec.
Okay.
If you told me it was your birthday, we would have asked far more questions to you to get your input. We would be celebrating that. The two of us are just withering on here.
No, but the thing is, I am 1 year older, which means I'm 1 year wiser in understanding that I don't know nearly enough about this stuff to keep up with the two of you. So it's been my pleasure to hear you guys talk about it. It's been really, really fascinating. AP, I've told everybody, go check out A Critical Dragon on YouTube. Just search that, you'll find the channel. Is there anything else that you want to give a shout out to from your work, or anything that you want people to check out?
Well, it would be really great if people did come and visit the channel. But the one thing I will say is my channel is about discussing these things. It's not about me having the answer, because very rarely is there a right answer. So I typically have a lot of videos where I'm discussing topics, not saying this is how you must. And, obviously I have my personal preferences and biases and prejudices like everyone else. But I really appreciate discussion about these topics. So if people want to come and have a look at the videos, that would be brilliant. But if it's not your thing, then congratulations, there's so much out there. Engage with other YouTubers, engage with other podcasts, read more, read fantasy books and science fiction, as well as classical fiction. Read everything, experience everything, because that is a brilliant education.
Hear, hear. Drew, anything besides inking out loud that you want to tell people about?
No, probably not.
Okay.
Unlike AP, I'm going to say only listen to Inking Out Loud.
Okay. Well, so thanks for saying that on my channel.
Yeah, exactly.
That.
Yeah,
That's
everybody
great.
jump ship from the Legendarium over to Inking Out Loud. Yeah, as if we don't already have like nearly complete overlap from the Inking Out Loud audience also listening to the Legendarium.
the Venn diagram is a near perfect circle. So yeah, thanks to both of you, and thank you to everybody who's listening and watching on YouTube. Yes, please like, subscribe. All the yes, I'm a YouTube whore now. That's fine. I can accept that moniker. Like and subscribe. Check out the podcast. Please go to thelegendarium.com for all the reasons I mentioned up top. And Drew, AP, I look forward to another discussion between the three of us in the future. But you guys, for now, have a good one.
Yeah, thanks, Craig.
Bye-bye.